Hello, hello, hello. How do you know if something's yours? How do you make something yours? Traditionally, there's two opinions. How do you make something yours? How do you know something's yours? It's attributed to a global disagreement. When you've got it in your hand, when you made the deal, right? To the degree that anything in the world is transferable, there's two forms, 2 degrees, 2 extremes of when and how something is yours. But let's be honest. A lot of it's about noticing when something is yours. Like, when does one realize or experience something as being theirs? And there's 2 opinions, and they're both active in the moment when the whole thing started. I'm generalizing, but I'm talking about the beginning of the entire problematic expression, concept, existence of Israel, right? Shabbat HaGadol. Let's say, when does the thing we associate with both Israel and Judaism really start to be? And people say Abraham, but, well, Abraham belongs to everyone, doesn't he? That's why he's Raham, you know? That Raham is everybody's Raham. And part of his problem, or part of his accomplishment, I would say, part of his model, is making things yours by paying for them. And paying for things is a bit of a magical thing. Being able to pay for things means you, like, whoa, somehow just have so much. And a lot of the Abrahamic context and concept, it's amazing how much he has, amazing how much he can afford. And it keeps happening, keeps doing a little better. And this is part of the promise and failure of slavery and oppression, right? There's a fascinating hermeneutic principle in the Sefer, saying, in describing the beginning of things that are awesome, that can become a problem, which is to say, things that can just go from being awesome to being a problem. Because let's say from hot to cold and wet to dry, I don't think there's much of a value judgment. It's either too much or it's not enough. And as soon as it becomes too much, it sort of becomes the other thing, right? If something is too wet and it's just absolute wet, then it's also preserved and dry somehow, right? If something is too hot and completely suffused and destroyed and sort of like burned to nothingness, it kind of turns into like a vapor. It's like a sort of cycle of existence, non-existence. That is the main thing I think we're all policing and administrating in our experience of being, in our experience of, I want to say, social justice on one hand, and just basic management of survival and curing on survival to make it a sort of wider scale survival, which I think is the main aspiration of structures, right? We build civilizations in the hope of keeping all the things within civilization successful and, And as much as hierarchies form of relative vulnerability, where a hierarchy depends a little bit on determining who is the most vulnerable and what circumstances. And this is the triumph and failure of systems, right? This is the thing that is successful in systems that then becomes a problem and a threat to other things. And this is coherence, right? And this is part of the problem of wisdom globally is animals and humans, monsters and angels, once informed, once they have a degree of knowledge and agency, well, what choice do they have but to be a wicked kind of strategic? And this is a recurring problem in the engagement of the world with itself, right? There's a long history and prehistory of the hope of the things that live, especially people like us, having a better heart and will to relate to each other from genuine concern and hope, the same way we experience it viscerally for ourselves. And in this way, the hope of the fundamentally serpentine sense of need can be extended outwards to a collective, as it naturally is with the mammals who love their kids, the ones who are able to do well enough to just love their kids and build around them. And to this end, I am going to review 2 books, one of which I got to read completely, and one of which I only got to see little images of. Now, I have the almost opposite relationship to these 2 books, and I wonder how much there is a overlap between what I feel and what you feel. And I think this is part of what we discover in the springtime, because we're exposed to each other and exposed to each other's garbage. We're all putting it outside, whatever it is. And this is like, goes back a long time, right? Taking everything out, putting it outside for everyone to see, but also amidst that, getting new things, right? Harvesting lightly, picking the wild greens that are finally coming up, making it to the parties that can finally exist. Just letting a cat out of the room. And amidst this, I want to acknowledge the 2 most interesting ciphers in these 2 books: Kosher Astrology by Yitzchak Pinchas, and an Anti-Zionist Siddur that was released also just now at the beginning of the last little moon, hardly released, kickstarted, and then sold out. I can't seem to find a copy very easily, but there was tremendous controversy shortly after it shipped because images from it got released. And the images, what was so controversial about them? Changing liturgy, all progressive siddurs change liturgy, adapt it so that there's more moms mentioned according to the local priority. And the moms do make it in there, I think, in brackets, depending on what kind of anti-Zionist shul you're in. But the thing that's really interesting and innovative is the translations and accessibility notes, which is the whole work of accessibility, making something yours. How do you know something's yours? You're comfortable with it. But there's 2 sides of that, right? Acquiring it, having it in your hand, versus, having somehow made a deal to have it. And I think this is a little bit the concern about legitimacy. Some of those are more work and therefore more earned, and some of those are more present and more noticed and witnessed. And they say part of the B'nai Yissaschar, Tzvi Elimelech of Dinav, the great Hasidic astrologer, argues strongly, why is the new moon of Aries so fundamental to Jewish identity, not just Israel, not just the sort of corporate body that emerges as a cohesion of Judah and something a little more wider and diagonal spanning than Judah. So like I was saying before, right? in the beginning of creation, there's like some fundamental forces: wet, cold, hot, dry, not in that order, and reconciliation between them. Just the original fundamental trinities, let's say, just extremes and polarities themselves at the beginning of extremes and polarities, which again do get expressed conceptually as both literal water and literal fire, which has dueling experiential impact that overlaps, right? Hot and cold, wet and dry. But these give way to recognition and memory in reaction to the experience of these things, right? Because what are these things I'm describing? Experiences that living things can have. You know, living things can't help but notice. And we're talking before consumption becomes a conscious thing. Because I think living things don't necessarily notice their hunger, or maybe it's all they notice, you know. But they don't necessarily notice the moment where they've switched from hungry to eating. They notice where when they're not hungry anymore. Once the thing that is dry inside is satisfied and wet, you know, wetted. The beginning of noticing is wisdom, and the beginning of being wrong because you remember things and then don't understand what's happening is ignorance. And this is the first of the 7 polarities in the Sefer Torah. And the polarities emerge into the problem fundamentally of inequality, right? Because there's, okay, fine, wisdom and ignorance, it's like a personal experience, right? But inequality is what comes from wisdom and ignorance, because wisdom and ignorance get together, have a baby, and that baby is called wealth, right? Wealth is made a little bit of the interaction between wisdom and ignorance, where a strategy can emerge that is so built on the things we don't know, and thus so effective because it's built on the marriage of the things we know and don't know. And wealth itself, as all the ancient texts agree, creates poverty, because where there is more, especially in the context of memory and association, is recognition of where there is less, and thus need. And this gives way in the Sefer Torah either to productivity, you know, production, seed, you know, fertility, which itself gives way to devastation, which gives way to life, which gives way to death, which gives way to power, authority. And authority creates servitude. Someone's there to help. And this is a little bit even the theology fundamentally of the sun and the moon, right? One of those is there to just help. And it's a little unclear which one. The name of the sun in Babylonian, right, and in Hebrew makes it sound like the sun is the servant. And that's a fun, meaningful inversion of the gender binary dynamic, where the one who is enslaving is the one who's enslaved, right? The solar itself, right? Because it is such a dominating force, it is the main thing that is yoked. It is the main thing that is harmonist for every other benefit and tempered in relationship to, because it is so ultimately self-driven and insensitive. Now, I don't want to say we're all ultimately self-driven and insensitive, but these 2 projects help me understand a little bit what's happening. Anti-Zionist Siddur is very straightforward, right? And the thing I like about it is the hope of taking the liturgy that is made of words that can be reassociated for whatever you and your community need them to mean, in a context that traditionally does beg to be elaborated. You know, there's a guy in front of the synagogue describing maybe a little bit what we mean when we say, you know, sacrifice or hope or peace, you know, just what it means that we're praying for, that somehow means you can find your heart and your heart's needs and prayers inside of what we're all doing amidst, like in karaoke, you know. But I have no perspective at all about how and why people are the way they are, except for, you know, stories and looking things up. Now, I was not excited about the concept of Yitzchak Pinscom's, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Kosher Astrology book. Astrology, sort of by definition, is the universal thing that skims off and above spirituality and is very much divorced ultimately from more unitive spirituality, where it is before the divisions. It is the language of the divisions themselves in the context of the inherent grid that lays itself on our experience. And a lot of it's very familiar, because hot, wet, cold, and dry is the 4 seasons and is the 12 months and is a little bit the formatting that I've been looking at for the last bunch of years to try to understand the movement from one thing to another within the range of polarities that one could try to draw intelligent conclusions from or intuitive conclusions from. And this is the main divorce, I think, between religion/spirituality and astrology and the sort of esoteric sciences that really interact with them, is perspective that sort of lets us feel like we know what we're doing versus perspective that lets us into what we are doing. And I want to say these are the two things, right? Se'u kachu. In order to have the initial Passover, the Hebrew slaves in Egypt had to do a thing that they never wanted to do, which is eat sheep. Maybe generationally inside, there's some kind of memory of, ancestors used to eat sheep, but that's taboo. Egyptians were grossed out by sheep, just like some kids are. Just the smell, it's like very strong, and uncivil in a way that was genuinely gross to whatever the Egyptian nobility was about. So we're told. Specifically because it's a problem, just get a hold of it and make sure to do it. But to get a hold of it, you have to announce yourself that you're having it, that it's yours, like slaves that rise up do. Announce that it's yours, but also be there. And let's acknowledge how much this is part of the initial criticism in the early stages of the problem with Jewish migration and control in Palestine, right? There's living somewhere for a long time, but then there's like paying the absentee landlord, right? Paying the absentee landlord. Does that really make something yours? It's really a huge debate crisis in the world. What makes something anybody's, right? What makes something indigenous? What makes something entitled? And it is the dance and conflict between liberalism and nationalism on some level, right? Where people feel deeply entitled to something because it's theirs, no matter what happens, as opposed to the deals that are made, the gambles that are lost, really meaning like, oh, I guess that's not mine anymore. This is a sort of anti-Jubilee nature of the contract thing. And I want to acknowledge something interesting that I learned from Kosher Astrology that is not out of my head ever since, because the main thing I don't love about it is that it's written for a religious audience to introduce how valid astrology is. And it just spends so much time just explaining why the thing it's doing is good, right? Kind of like a hasbara. But what is hasbara, right? For people who want to feel good about what they're doing, to know good news. There's great news. You actually can and should feel good about what you're doing, right? Leviticus, the center book of the 5 books of Moses, starts out talking about sacrifices, right? And it just mentions the sacrifices that you might want to offer kind of for no reason, just to say thanks. Just one that you just burn up completely. That's the first one, is like, if you want to burn a sacrifice completely, here's how you do it. It's the first thing we have to do every day. And then if you want to offer up, some peace offerings, that's great. You feel good? You want to say, make everything happy. So you get to eat some of it, and the guy offering it for you, the professionals there get to have some of it. It's great. But what if you feel awful about something you did? So there's a sacrifice for that too. It's goat, male sheep, or, if you can't afford male sheep and male goat, like 2 birds. You got to burn one completely and the other one sort of you can have some from. Or if you can't afford any of that, but you still just feel awful, you can do grain, go up, pick some pick some grain, toast it up, give it to the priests, the doctors, and then you'll feel better. And then, startlingly, the book of Leviticus begins to describe what else you might be feeling that you might want to offer a sacrifice for, right? There's a sin offering, and it lists some sins, just didn't pay somebody on time, just like kept something, didn't notice. And it gives a couple examples. Opens with something somebody does wrong, whatever it is. And then it says, and they don't know what it is, and they still feel it. So that's a shame offering. It's just like a sin offering, but we can talk less about it. And then, what if the leader of a community, the anointed doctor, Kohen Mashiach, of like the community, the minister, the real minister, and he does something wrong. So there's also a format that's very similar, a little bigger. What if a whole community does something wrong and they don't realize it? Now, the language in the Bible is actually even more scandalous than the language I'm using. Hamitzvah asher tziviti lechem lo lasot, I think it is. Like, it's called a mitzvah. What if you do something? What if you do a mitzvah that I told you not to do, and then you realize later on how awful it is, and then all there is to do is to be sorry? So the whole ritual, everyone, like, not everyone, just the leaders of the community, the representatives of the community, put their hands on the head of a goat and sacrifice it and pour it out, and that should help. And then they start listing all the different things that you might have done that you may not realize were a problem, that eventually you can try to own up on and fix. And I think this really depends so much on what individuals and communities are capable of noticing. Now, the main real thing I learned from Kosher Astrology, his main interesting, innovative theory, beyond just sort of explaining why any of it's good or okay, the main kind of breakthrough, I think, cognitively, that I enjoyed from it and helps me understand and relate to the rest of the global crisis moment that we're having, which is, let's be honest, the only reason to learn religion and stuff, relate to the global crisis, moral and social and functional. He does an interesting thing in chapter 3, right? The book starts as just kind of explaining the history of astrology and the Torah and all the guys who say yes, and explaining a little bit where the problem is and isn't, eventually getting to a theory of what modernity is teaching us and what are the main forces in modernity. And he does this conveniently through acknowledging the planets that were only discovered in modernity and their overlap with the things happening in that time. Uranus and Neptune, Pluto and Chiron. Part 2 of this is going to be explaining about that in about 20 minutes.